Every morning at 5 o'clock, my husband adjusted his collar, grabbed his keys, and said the same thing before leaving. I can't be late for work again. I believed him for years until one freezing morning, a forgotten phone vibrated on the tool shelf. I answered without thinking. A little boy whispered, "Dad, are you coming?" Mom said I can't be late for school again. Before I could breathe, a cold voice cut through. "Tell your father to hurry. He knows the boy hates waiting." I stood frozen, realizing he'd never been leaving for work. Thank you for being here with me. Before we dive in, drop a quick comment. Let me know, is it morning, afternoon, or late night where you are? I genuinely appreciate you listening. Just a quick note, some details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. The heart of it, the message, is what I hope stays with you. I counted 1,072 mornings before I understood what I was counting. My name is Roxanne Caldwell, 55 years old, and for 30 years, I believed I knew the man sleeping beside me. I stood at the bedroom window of the Caldwell estate, watching the Blue Ridge Mountains catch the first light of September dawn. The house had belonged to my father, a man who taught me that observation is the foundation of truth. He'd been a museum curator, and so had I once before. I became a wife who watched her husband leave at 5 in the morning without asking why. Lawrence Sinclair. My husband of 30 years, 58 years old, managing partner of a resort development firm, left the house at 5 o'clock without a word. I didn't need to look at the clock anymore. My body had learned the rhythm the way you learn a song you don't remember choosing to memorize. From my window on the second floor, I watched him walk to the car parked in the circular drive. He checked his watch twice. Always twice. First when he stepped onto the gravel, then again when he reached the driver's door. He adjusted his collar even though it didn't need adjusting. He glanced back at the house but never looked up. Never met my eyes through the glass. The resort development company he managed didn't open until 8. I had never asked him why he left 3 hours early. 1,072 mornings. I started counting the week after our daughter Celestine moved to Boston for graduate school. That was 3 years ago, almost to the day. At first I told myself I was being paranoid. Husbands leave early for work, they have meetings, they stop for coffee. They sit in parking lots reading the newspaper because they prefer silence to conversation over breakfast. But I kept counting anyway. I cataloged every detail with the precision my father had taught me when I was young, and still believed that naming things gave you power over them. The way Lawrence's left hand trembled slightly when he unlocked the car door. The way he never turned on the radio until after he'd pulled out of the driveway. The way he drove slowly, carefully, like a man who had something precious to protect. You understand what it means to count something for 3 years without knowing why you're counting, don't you? It means you already know the answer. You just haven't let yourself name it yet. 15 minutes after Lawrence's taillights disappeared down the mountain road, I heard the sound. A vibration, faint but insistent, coming from the garage. I pulled on my robe and descended the stairs, in the pre-dawn silence, my bare feet cold against the hardwood my father had installed 40 years ago when he built this house for my mother. The hallway was dark except for the thin blue light coming through the east windows. I could smell the faint scent of Lawrence's cologne still lingering in the air, expensive and clean. The garage door opened with a soft creak. I fumbled for the light switch, and fluorescent tubes flickered to life overhead, casting everything in harsh yellow. The smell of old engine oil was sharp in the cold morning air. My breath made small clouds. The phone sat on the tool shelf exactly where Lawrence must have set it down and forgotten. It wasn't his primary phone that one never left his pocket. This was smaller, cheaper, the kind you buy at a discount store with cash. It vibrated again. The screen lit up. No name, just a number. I picked it up thinking emergency, thinking accident, thinking hospital. Hello. A boy's voice. Young, maybe 10 years old. Dad, are you coming? Mom said I can't be late for school again. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The garage was silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the phone still vibrating in my hand with the boy's voice on the other end. Dad, can you hear me? Then a woman's voice, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had been calling this number for years. Tell your father to hurry. He knows Silas hates waiting. The woman Savannah Ramsey I would learn later, 36 years old with the kind of certainty in her voice that comes from intimacy, spoke like someone who owned a piece of my husband I didn't know existed. She spoke like someone who had been waking up at 5 in the morning for a long time, like someone who knew his schedule better than I did. "Silas, give me the phone," she said, and I heard the boy protest in the background before the line went dead. I stood in the yellow fluorescent light holding a stranger's phone. The screen went dark. I could see my reflection in the black glass. My hand was steady. That surprised me. I set the phone down on the tool shelf exactly where I'd found it. I walked to the car parked beside the empty space where Lawrence's vehicle had been and looked at my reflection in the side mirror. My face was perfectly calm. No tears. No shock. No trembling. That was what frightened me most. My hands weren't shaking. My breath was even. I looked like a woman who had just discovered her husband had another family the way I might have looked, discovering a mislabeled artifact at the museum with cool professional interest, with the part of my mind that knew how to catalog evidence. I had counted 1,072 mornings, 3 years of 5 o'clock departures, 3 years of silence, and now I knew what I'd been counting. A boy's voice calling Lawrence Dad. A woman named Savannah speaking with the casual authority of someone who had every right to know where he was and when he'd arrive. A child named Silas who couldn't be late for school again. I looked in the car mirror one more time. My face was so calm I almost didn't recognize myself. The notebook was already in my hands before I realized I had crossed from the garage to my study. My father's study, really. Though he'd been gone for 5 years, I still thought of it as the walnut desk he'd imported from Denmark, the leather chair that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, even though he'd quit smoking 30 years before he died. The window looked east over the valley, and in another hour the sun would rise over the mountains and fill this room with the kind of light my father said made everything look honest. I sat down and opened the notebook to the first blank page. It was bound in burgundy leather, the kind they don't make anymore. I'd used it 20 years ago when I worked as a textile curator at the Asheville Museum before Celestine was born, before I became the kind of woman who stayed home and counted mornings. The pages still smelled like the storage rooms where we kept the antique fabrics dry and faintly sweet like old paper and preservation dust. I have preserved precious things my whole life. Paintings, tapestries, artifacts, centuries old. My father taught me that the difference between history and memory is documentation. Memory fades, memory lies. But if you write it down with precision, if you record every detail the way an archaeologist catalogs a dig site, then you have something that lasts. I wrote the date at the top of the page, September 14th, 2024, 5:32 a.m. Then I wrote everything. The phone number from the call log, the 2 addresses I'd found saved in the contacts, one under Silas, one under Savannah. The residential address I recognized, Spartanburg, South Carolina, an hour and 40 minutes south. The second was commercial, a street number I didn't know but would look up later when the libraries opened and I could use a computer that wasn't connected to our home network. I wrote the boy's exact words, "Dad, are you coming? Mom said I can't be late for school again." I wrote the woman's voice, "Tell your father to hurry. He knows Silas hates waiting." The pen was almost out of ink, but I pressed hard enough to leave an impression on 3 pages beneath. My father had taught me that too. Always make a carbon copy of the truth. When I finished writing, I stood and walked to the small kitchen alcove my father had installed in the corner of the study. He used to work 16-hour days and refused to stop for meals. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner. While the water heated, I looked out the window at the lightening sky. I had spent 20 years teaching people to look at fabric and see the hands that wove it, the story, in every thread. I taught them to notice the things most people missed, the places where the dye changed slightly, because the weaver ran out of the first batch, the tiny repairs that told you someone had loved this tapestry enough to fix it, instead of replacing it. I taught them that if you looked closely enough, every object would tell you the truth about the person who made it. And I had never looked at my own life that way. The kettle whistled. I poured the water over a tea bag and sat at my father's desk, watching the steam rise in the cold morning air. The house was silent, except for the old furnace clicking on in the basement. I waited. At 6:30, I heard the sound of gravel crunching in the driveway. I carried my tea to the kitchen and set it on the counter. I heard the front door open, heard Lawrence's footsteps in the hallway faster than usual, slightly uneven. He was worried. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face flushed from the cold, or maybe from the speed he'd driven back up the mountain. "I forgot my phone," he said. "It's on the counter in the garage." I said, my voice steady as I poured his coffee into the blue mug he preferred. 2 sugars, no cream. I had made this coffee for 30 years. He disappeared toward the garage and returned a moment later with the phone in his hand. I watched him glance at the screen, checking for missed calls, checking to see if anything had been disturbed. His shoulders relaxed slightly when he saw the screen was dark. "Thank God," he said, sliding the phone into his pocket. "I don't know how I forgot it." Long day ahead. I asked the same question I had asked for 3 decades. Conference call at 8, then site visits in Greenville. Greenville was east, Spartanburg was south. I noted that. He drank the coffee, standing at the counter the way he always did when he was running late. The kitchen smelled like it always did on Sunday morning's coffee, and the faint scent of wood smoke from the fireplace we'd lit the night before. The coffee cup in my hand was warm. The man across from me was a stranger. "Thanks," he said, and kissed my cheek the way he always did, brief, automatic, already thinking about something else. "Drive safe," I said. I walked him to the door and watched him get into his car for the second time that morning. He backed out of the driveway, raised one hand in a small wave, and turned onto the mountain road. I stood in the doorway until the taillights disappeared into the September fog. I realized I was smiling, the same small, pleasant smile I had perfected over 30 years of marriage. The smile that said everything was fine, that I was content, that I trusted him completely. I didn't know when I had learned to smile like that. I didn't know which parts of our marriage had ever been real and which parts I had simply gotten used to performing. I watched his car back out of the driveway, taillights disappearing down the mountain road in the September fog. 30 years, I thought. I had believed I knew everything about this man, where he went, what he cared about, who he loved. I had been wrong about all of it. I had been following my husband's car for 43 minutes before I realized I was crossing the state line into South Carolina. The decision to follow him had taken less than a day. I woke at 4:45 the next morning, dressed in dark jeans and a black jacket I hadn't worn in years, and parked my car on the turnout below the estate with the headlights off. When Lawrence's taillights appeared in the pre-dawn darkness, I waited until he rounded the first curve before starting my engine. The fog was thick coming down the mountain. I stayed far enough back that he wouldn't notice my headlights in his rearview mirror, close enough that I wouldn't lose him in the curves. By the time we reached the interstate, the sun was starting to rise and I could see his car clearly, the silver sedan he'd bought 2 years ago, the one he said was better on gas for long drives. He drove south, past the exit for his office in Charlotte, past the exits for Gastonia and Shelby. I checked the odometer and did the math in my head. 97 miles from our house to the subdivision where he finally turned off. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a careless affair conducted in hotel rooms 10 minutes from home. This was calculated. Geographic separation, designed so that no one from Highlands would ever accidentally see him in Spartanburg. No overlapping grocery stores or gas stations, no shared restaurants or neighbors or communities. He had built a second life exactly far enough away that the first one would never find it. At 6:45, he exited into a neighborhood that looked like it had been built in the last 5 years. Manicured lawns, 2-story homes with 3-car garages, the kind of subdivision where every house cost $500,000 and looked almost exactly like the one next to it. He pulled into a driveway halfway down the street. I parked 3 houses back and watched. The front door opened before he reached it. The woman who appeared was younger than me, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, and the kind of casual elegance that takes effort to look effortless. A woman appeared at the doorway younger than me, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, moving with the kind of casual elegance that takes effort to look effortless. She opened the door before he reached it, the practiced timing of someone who has done this 1,000 mornings. I would learn her name later, Savannah Ramsey. She opened the door before he reached it, the practiced timing of someone who has done this 1,000 mornings. Then the boy ran out. The boy who ran from the house was young, 10, maybe 11, small for his age, wearing a private academy uniform. He adjusted his collar, and the gesture was so familiar, it stopped my breath. Lawrence used to adjust Celestine's collar exactly that way before school. I lifted my phone and started taking pictures. He wore a navy blazer with a school crest I couldn't make out from this distance. Lawrence dropped to one knee, and the boy threw his arms around his neck. I watched my husband hold a child who called him Dad, watched him adjust the boy's collar and say something that made him laugh. How many times had I stood at that same doorway waving goodbye to Lawrence, believing I was the only woman who did? I lifted my phone and started taking pictures. Lawrence put Silas in the back seat of his car and backed out of the driveway. The woman Savannah stood at the door and waved. The kind of wave I used to give when Celestine was young. Automatic, maternal, entitled to it. The Range Rover in the driveway was white, recent model, easily $180,000 if I had to guess. The house looked new. The landscaping was professional. This wasn't a cheap arrangement. This was a second household being maintained at the level of the first. I photographed the license plate. I photographed the house number. I photographed the school crest on the uniform when Lawrence's car turned, and the morning light caught the emblem on the boy's blazer. Then I zoomed in on the photos I'd taken of the boy's face. The subdivision was so quiet I could hear a dog barking 3 streets over and the hum of my own breathing inside the car. I stared at the screen. The boy's eyes were green, not hazel, not brown that looked different in certain light. Green. Lawrence's eyes were brown. Had been brown for all 30 years I'd known him, dark brown, almost black in dim light. I had looked into those eyes on our wedding day. I had watched those eyes look at our daughter for the first time in the hospital. Brown eyes like his mother Mildred's, like his father's had been according to the photos I'd seen. Green eyes don't come from brown-eyed parents. Not both parents. I remembered that much from the genetics unit I'd taught Celestine when she was studying for her biology exam in high school. I zoomed in closer on the photo. The boy's face was turned toward Lawrence mid-laugh, and his eyes were unmistakably brilliantly green. I saved the photo to my phone. Then I texted it to myself so it would be in my email. Then I uploaded it to the cloud storage account I'd created that morning using a password Lawrence didn't know. I opened my notebook and wrote Silas Ramsey, age approximately 10, green eyes, LHS, eyes brown. I underlined it twice. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet, but I knew it meant something. My father had taught me that the details that don't fit are the ones that matter most. I sat in my car for another hour after Lawrence drove away, staring at the photo of the boy's face on my phone screen. Green eyes. Lawrence's eyes were brown, had been brown for all 30 years I had known him. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I saved the photo to 3 different locations and wrote the detail in my notebook with double underlining. The boy's eyes were green, not Lawrence's brown. I kept that detail. The photograph was 30 years old, and the man in it no longer existed. I sat in my study that evening with the wedding album open on my lap, staring at a moment I had stopped believing in. The photo showed us on the steps of the Highlands Presbyterian Church in June of 1994. I was 25 years old. Lawrence was 28. We looked impossibly young, impossibly certain. I was 25 years old when that photo was taken, and I thought I knew what devotion looked like. 6 months before our wedding, my car had gone off the mountain road during a winter storm. Black ice on a curve I'd driven 1,000 times. The car rolled twice before hitting a tree. I woke up in a hospital in Asheville with a concussion, internal bleeding, and a shattered collarbone. Lawrence had been in Charlotte for work 3 hours away in good weather, longer in the blizzard that was still coming down. They told me later he'd left the moment he got my father's call. Drove through conditions the highway patrol was begging people to avoid. Arrived at the hospital before I woke from surgery. My blood type was AB negative. The hospital's supply was critically low. Lawrence didn't hesitate. rolled up his sleeve and donated before anyone asked. When I woke at 2 in the morning, groggy and confused, he was asleep in the chair beside my bed. His arm was bandaged from the donation. His clothes were still wet from the snow. He had driven through a blizzard and given his blood to save my life. That memory had been my answer to every doubt I'd had in 30 years of marriage. Every time he came home late, every time he was distant or distracted, every time I felt like I was living with a stranger, I would think about that night, about the man who loved me enough to risk his life driving through a storm, who gave his blood without being asked, who fell asleep in an uncomfortable chair because he couldn't bear to leave me alone. That memory had been my anchor for 3 decades. Now it was the weight pulling me under. Because if that man had existed, the one who drove through a blizzard for me, then what did it mean that he had become the man who drove 97 miles every morning to hold a different child, kiss a different woman, build a different life? I closed the album and set it on the desk. The photograph showed us young and certain and in love. The man in that photograph had saved my life. The man I'd followed to South Carolina had been stealing from me for a decade. They were the same person. That was the part I couldn't reconcile. 3 days later, I spread the Caldwell Estate financial records across my office desk. $31 million. That was what my father had left me when he died 5 years ago. Trust funds he'd built over 40 years as a museum curator who'd lived modestly and invested wisely. Real estate in Highlands and Asheville. Blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds, a legacy he'd intended to pass to Celestine someday. I had managed it all myself for the past 10 years, reviewed every account quarterly, signed every statement, approved every major expense. My father had taught me that wealth wasn't about spending. It was about preservation, about stewarding something bigger than yourself so the next generation would have what you'd had. I thought I'd been careful. I started with the trust accounts and worked backward through 5 years of statements, then 7, then 10. That's when I found them. Small transfers never more than $50,000 at a time disguised as business expenses or property maintenance, routed through an LLC called Crowther Asset Management. The name appeared on 17 different statements over 10 years, always in amounts small enough that I'd assumed they were legitimate consulting fees, property services management costs for the rental properties we owned. I pulled up the state business registry on my laptop and searched for Crowther Asset Management. It existed, registered in South Carolina in 2014, 10 years ago, the same year Silas was born. I went back through the statements with a highlighter and marked every transaction that involved that company. Then I added them up. $2.3 million. He had stolen my family's money to build his second family. $850,000 for a house. I recognized the address, Spartanburg, the subdivision I'd watched him drive to. $180,000 for a white Range Rover. $900,000 transferred into an investment account in Savannah's name. $370,000 in living expenses, spread across a decade school tuition household, cost the kind of steady support you give a family. My family's money, funding his other family for 10 years. The transfers had started in 2014 and continued every quarter like clockwork. $50,000 here, $30,000 there. Never enough to trigger alarm, always labeled as something legitimate. I thought about all the Friday dinners we'd had in those 10 years. Lawrence sitting across from me at the table asking about my day, talking about his work, mentioning his mother's health, or the progress on his office renovations. Normal conversations, routine intimacy. Every Friday for 10 years while he was systematically stealing from the inheritance my father had spent a lifetime building. I sat back in my chair and looked at the pattern I had just uncovered. 10 years of theft, starting the exact year Silas was born, routed through a company whose name I didn't yet recognize, but would soon learn belonged to Savannah's brother. Lawrence hadn't just betrayed me. He had been systematically looting my inheritance to fund a life I knew nothing about. $2.3 million, 10 years. Every Friday dinner as if nothing happened. Mildred poured the tea the way she had every Sunday afternoon for 30 years, and I watched her hands and wondered when she had started lying to me. The financial records were still spread across my office desk downstairs. 10 years of systematic theft. Lawrence's signature on every transfer. My signature on every quarterly review, never noticing what he'd been doing right under my careful watch. But now, sitting in my mother-in-law's upstairs sitting room, watching her measure out exactly 1.5 teaspoons of sugar into my cup, the way she'd memorized, I wondered who else had known. Mildred Sinclair, 79 years old, former chairwoman of the Historical Preservation Society, sat across from me in her upstairs sitting room, pouring tea with the same practiced grace she had demonstrated at 1,000 formal events. My mother-in-law, for 3 decades, who I was just beginning to understand, had never truly been mine. "How was your week, dear?" She asked the same opening she'd used every Sunday since Lawrence and I married. "Quiet," I said. "Lawrence has been busy with work. He works too hard, always has." She handed me the teacup bone china so thin you could see the shadow of tea through it. Just like his father. The room was exactly as it had been for 30 years. Antique furniture that had belonged to her grandmother. Family portraits on every wall. Mildred's great-grandfather, who'd founded the first bank in Highlands. Her mother, who'd been president of the Garden Society Lawrence at age 12 in his boarding school uniform. Not a single photograph of Celestine. I'd never noticed that before. "I was thinking the other day," I said carefully, "about grandchildren. How nice it would be to have some running around the estate someday." Mildred's face transformed. For just a moment before she caught herself, pure joy lit her features. Her eyes brightened. Her mouth curved into a smile I hadn't seen in years. "The smart boy," she said, her voice warm with unmistakable pride. "He's brilliant, really. Reading at 2 grade levels ahead. The future of the family requires—" She seemed to hear herself. The smile froze. The teacup stopped halfway to her lips. She said slowly, carefully, "the future of the family requires strong foundations, education, values." She set the teacup down on the saucer with a soft clink. "More tea, dear." I watched her hands shake slightly as she reached for the pot. How many Sunday afternoons had we sat here discussing garden tours and historical preservation, while she knew exactly where Lawrence went every morning, while she knew about Savannah and the house in Spartanburg, and the boy with green eyes who called my husband Dad. "No, thank you," I said. "I should use the powder room before I go." "Of course. You know where it is." I left my teacup on the side table and walked down the hallway to the small bathroom with its silk wallpaper and crystal fixtures. I washed my hands slowly, counting to 60 in my head the way my father had taught me when I needed to think clearly through panic. When I came back out, I could hear Mildred in the kitchen talking on the phone in the low voice she used when she didn't want to be overheard. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked into her sitting room and looked at the writing desk by the window. It was a beautiful piece, mahogany with inlaid brass, a family heirloom she'd inherited from her mother. The surface was organized with military precision. Bills in one stack, correspondence in another, a small dish for stamps and paper clips. There was a receipt lying face up beside her checkbook. I picked it up. Ridgemont Academy, Spartanburg, South Carolina. 1 semester tuition payment $12,000. Paid in full. Student name Silas Ramsey. Date March 2024, 6 months ago. The handwriting on the check notation was Mildred's. I recognized her sharp, angular script from 30 years of holiday cards and thank you notes. The room smelled like bergamot tea and furniture polish and 30 years of believing I belonged to this family. I heard Mildred's footsteps in the hallway. I set the receipt back exactly where I'd found it and moved to the window looking out at the garden as if I'd been admiring the view. "Sorry about that," Mildred said, coming back into the room. "Garden Society business. They can never make a decision without calling me." "Your roses look beautiful this year." "Thank you, dear." The gardener finally listened to me about the fertilizer schedule. We finished our tea. We discussed the Historical Society's autumn fundraiser. We talked about the weather and the new restaurant opening in town and whether the maple trees would turn early this year. Normal conversation. Routine intimacy. 30 years of Sunday afternoons. When I left, she kissed my cheek at the door the way she always did. "See you next week, dear." "Of course, Mother." I had called this woman Mother for 30 years. attended her charity galas, managed her medical appointments when she had pneumonia 2 years ago, sat by her bedside after her husband's funeral and held her hand while she cried, organized her estate finances because she said she trusted me more than anyone. She had paid for Silas's private school tuition, not Lawrence, not Savannah, Mildred. She had written a check for $12,000 to a school in South Carolina for a boy who wasn't supposed to exist. 6 months ago, while she sat across from me at these Sunday teas, asking about my week and commenting on the weather, I folded the receipt and placed it back exactly where I found it. My hand steady despite the realization spreading through me like ice water. For 30 years, I had called this woman, mother, attended her charity galas, managed her estate affairs, sat through these Sunday teas, believing she cared about me. She had known before I ever picked up that phone in the garage. She had known, and she had chosen him. For 30 years, I called her mother. She knew before I picked up that phone. The memory I had buried for 13 years came back that night with the clarity of something that had been waiting to be remembered. I lay in the dark bedroom listening to Lawrence's breathing beside me, steady and deep, the sleep of someone with nothing to hide, or someone who had practiced hiding so well that guilt no longer kept him awake. Mildred's receipt was still in my purse downstairs. $12,000 for a boy who wasn't supposed to exist, paid by a woman I had called mother for 3 decades. But understanding why she had chosen him required going back to the place I had spent 13 years trying to forget. 2011, the hospital in Asheville. I was 42 years old when I lost the baby, and I thought the grief would kill both of us. The pregnancy had been unexpected. Celestine was already in college. Lawrence and I were settled into middle age, and suddenly I was nauseous every morning and craving foods I hadn't eaten in years. The doctor confirmed it at 15 weeks. A boy, due in March. Lawrence had been quiet when I told him, but I'd thought it was shock. Happy shock. The kind that takes time to process. The bleeding started on a Tuesday in October. I was 23 weeks along. Far enough that I had started buying small things, a blue blanket, a book of lullabies. Far enough that when they did the ultrasound at the hospital and the screen went still and the technician's face changed, I knew what she was going to say before she said it. I'm sorry, there's no heartbeat. They induced labor the next day. I delivered a son who had never taken a breath. 6 months of carrying him, and he was gone before I ever heard him cry. Lawrence sat in the chair beside my hospital bed. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just sat there looking hollowed out like someone had reached inside him and removed something essential. Mildred arrived 2 days later. I was still in the hospital. They'd kept me for monitoring because of complications. I remember waking from a medication haze to see her standing at the foot of my bed in her pearl necklace and careful makeup looking at me the way someone looks at a broken appliance they're considering whether to repair or replace. "The Sinclair family needs an heir," she said. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. "Having only daughters isn't enough for a family like ours. Perhaps this is God's way of telling you something." I couldn't speak. Couldn't process that she was saying this to me while I was still bleeding from the loss of her grandson. Lawrence sat in that chair and looked at his hands. He didn't defend me, didn't tell his mother to leave, didn't say anything at all, and something in him closed that never opened again. That hospital room 13 years ago was where my marriage ended, even though we stayed together for another decade and a half. He had needed me to be strong enough to fight his mother's cruelty, and I had been too broken to fight anything. So we both just stayed, went through the motions, came home to the estate and had polite dinners and slept in the same bed and pretended we were still the people we had been before. 3 years later, he met Savannah. The next morning, I went to my study and pulled up the business records for Crowther Asset Management. Incorporated February 2013. Delaware LLC, registered agent listed as Desmond Ramsey. 18 months after I lost the baby. The first financial transfer appeared 6 months later, August 2013. Silas wasn't born until December 2014. That sequence told me something important. Savannah hadn't trapped Lawrence with a pregnancy. She had already built the financial infrastructure before the child existed. The pregnancy came later, Confirmation of what was already in motion, not the beginning of it. She'd been planning this before Lawrence even knew he was being planned. I ran a search for Desmond Ramsey and found him immediately, married to Savannah Crowther in 2012. 2 children, though only Silas appeared in recent photos. Background in offshore asset management and yacht brokering before founding his consulting firm. Then I started looking for conference photos. Lawrence had attended dozens of industry events over the years, resort development summits, hospitality conferences, commercial real estate symposiums. Most of them had photo galleries archived online, the kind of corporate documentation no one ever looks at twice. I found what I was looking for in a 2014 conference in Charlotte. The photos showed a networking event, maybe 200 people in business attire with cocktails and name tags. Lawrence stood near a sponsor's booth, smiling at the camera. Behind him was a promotional banner for Meridian Yacht Sales. Standing in front of that banner, holding a champagne flute and looking directly at the camera with practiced confidence, was Savannah Ramsey. 31 years old at the time, beautiful in the calculated way of someone who had learned to use beauty as currency. Employed by a yacht company that catered to wealthy men looking to make purchases that would impress women exactly like her. The conference was in March 2014. Silas was born in December 2014. 9 months. They had studied him like a museum curator studies a valuable acquisition, cataloging his wealth, his vulnerability, his desperate need to be understood by someone who wasn't grieving the same loss. I found another photo from 2 months later. A smaller event, regional developers only. Lawrence and Savannah standing together, her hand on his arm, both of them laughing at something off camera. The body language was unmistakable. I remembered something he had said once during an argument I could barely recall now. We'd been fighting about something trivial, his mother's opinions about our vacation plans, or whether we were spending enough time in Highlands versus Asheville. He'd said it quietly, almost to himself. Someone finally understands me in a way you don't. I had thought he was talking about a business associate, someone at the office who appreciated his vision or understood the pressure he was under. He had been talking about her. I sat back and looked at the evidence spread across my desk, the timeline, the photos. The shell company and corporation date the first financial transfer. They hadn't fallen in love. They had chosen him the way predators choose wounded prey, because he was in pain, because he was rich, because his mother had convinced him he was a failure. Perfect. They chose him because he's in pain and he's rich. Perfect prey. I set the teacup down carefully on the dining room table and watched my hand tremble, a tremor I had been pretending not to notice for 6 months. They had chosen Lawrence as prey because he was wounded and wealthy. But now, understanding that predatory pattern, I was beginning to see how they had extended their hunting beyond him. To me. "You look tired, dear," Lawrence said, setting a fresh cup of tea in front of me the way he had every evening for almost 2 years. "I've made it the way you like. Earl Grey with honey and a splash of cream. The same tea I had been drinking for 3 decades. Except for the past 23 months, Lawrence had insisted on preparing it himself. Caring for his aging wife, he called it, taking the burden off me. I looked at the steam rising from the cup and cataloged the symptoms I had been dismissing as natural aging for 2 years. The dizziness that came 30 minutes after dinner, not every night, but most nights. Enough that I had started sitting down immediately after meals instead of clearing the dishes. The persistent fatigue that made me need a nap every afternoon, unusual for someone who had once worked 12-hour days at the museum without complaint. The tremor in my hands each morning, slight but noticeable when I held a pen or tried to button my shirt. I'd mentioned it to my doctor 8 months ago. She said it could be early Parkinson's or just age-related decline, had suggested monitoring it. The occasional confusion about small details, forgetting what day it was, misplacing my phone, walking into a room and forgetting why I'd come there. I had attributed all of it to being 55 and tired, to stress about Celestine being far away in Boston, to the natural slowing that happens when you cross into middle age. But the symptoms had started 23 months ago, within weeks of Lawrence taking over the tea preparation. I watched him move at the sideboard, measuring out my evening supplements with practiced efficiency. Vitamin D, calcium, magnesium, or so he told me. Small capsules that he placed in a tiny dish beside my teacup every night. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked, noting that I hadn't touched the tea. "Just tired," I said. "I might skip the tea tonight and go straight to bed." Something flickered across his face. Not concern, calculation. "You should drink it," he said gently. "The warmth will help you sleep, and you need your supplements." 2 years. He had been doing this for 2 years, while I thanked him for taking such good care of me. I picked up the cup and pretended to sip, let him see me swallow, nodded as if the warmth was soothing. When he turned away to clear his dinner plate, I poured half the cup into the cloth napkin on my lap and folded it carefully. "You're right," I said. "I do feel better." He smiled, kissed the top of my head on his way to the kitchen. "Good. You need to take care of yourself." I sat alone at the dining room table holding a napkin full of poisoned tea and understood what they had been building toward. It wasn't just about stealing from me or maintaining Lawrence's double life. They were preparing to erase me entirely. At 5:30 the next morning, before Lawrence woke, I was in the kitchen making coffee when Colleen appeared in the doorway. Colleen Whitfield, 62 years old, had worked as housekeeper for the Caldwell family for 32 years, since before I married into it, since my father was alive, and she stood in my kitchen at dawn with photographic evidence that someone was trying to kill me. She closed the door behind her, checked the hallway, turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Fear. "I tried to tell you 8 months ago," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You said it was probably vitamins that I was being paranoid. After that, I started watching. I set up my phone to record whenever the motion sensor light in your hallway came on at night. Last night it triggered. That's when I got this." She pulled out her phone and showed me the photograph. I remembered, vaguely. Colleen mentioning something about Lawrence's evening routine, about how I should be careful about what I ate and drank. I had dismissed it as overcautiousness from someone who had known me since I was a young bride. "I'm listening now," I said. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph. Timestamp 12:47 a.m. last night. The image showed the medicine cabinet in my bathroom, lit by the nightlight I kept on for midnight trips to the toilet. 2 hands, female, elderly, with the distinctive sapphire ring Mildred wore on her right hand, removing a prescription bottle from the middle shelf, placing a different bottle in its place, slipping the original into a designer handbag visible at the edge of the frame. "Last night I couldn't sleep," Colleen said. "I got up to get water and saw a light in your wing. I thought maybe you were sick. When I got closer, I heard someone in your bathroom. I looked through the crack in the door and saw Mrs. Sinclair at the medicine cabinet." The timestamp on the photo read 12:47 a.m. Mildred in my kitchen in the middle of the night switching my medication. "She was swapping your blood pressure pills," Colleen continued. "The ones you take every morning. I don't know what she replaced them with, but I waited until she left and I switched them back. The ones she put in the cabinet are in my room. I thought you should know." Colleen had worked for my family for 32 years. She had served coffee at my wedding, had held Celestine as a newborn, had cleaned this house through every season and every crisis and every normal Tuesday for longer than I'd been married. She knew every secret this house had ever held, and now she was handing me the most dangerous one. I looked at the photo on Colleen's phone, Mildred's hands, clearly visible, one bottle going into the cabinet, another into her designer handbag, and understood that this had moved beyond betrayal and theft into something far more calculated. They weren't just stealing my money and my husband. They were erasing me from my own home, one poisoned cup of tea at a time. Colleen knows every secret in this house. Now she's giving me the most dangerous one. The first thing I did was lock my study door and pull the archival preservation kit from the shelf, where it had sat unused since I left the museum 10 years ago. Colleen had given me the most dangerous secret this house held, and now I needed to turn that secret into evidence that could survive scrutiny in ways that mere testimony could not. The kit was exactly as I'd left it. Acid-free specimen bags in 3 sizes, archival labels printed on pH-neutral paper cotton gloves to prevent contamination, a jeweler's loop for close examination. Tools I'd used to preserve 300-year-old tapestries and Renaissance-era illuminated manuscripts. Tools that could preserve evidence of my own slow murder with the same meticulous care. I had spent 20 years teaching graduate students the proper way to preserve fragile materials-controlled environment, minimal handling documentation of every detail. Now I would apply those same principles to save my own life. The tea sample from the night before was still in the napkin I'd folded in my lap. I transferred it carefully into a specimen bag, sealed it, and labeled it with date, time, and source. October 12, 2024, 7:15 p.m. Evening tea prepared by LHS. I photographed it from 3 angles using my phone, then again with my old digital camera for redundancy. I recorded the details in a new notebook, not my old burgundy journal, but a fresh composition book I'd bought that morning at the drugstore using cash. I logged every symptom I'd experienced in the past 2 years, the dates when tremors began, when the dizziness started. When my handwriting first showed signs of degradation, I could see it in old grocery lists, in signed checks, the slow deterioration I'd attributed to age but now recognized as chemical intervention. The swapped medication bottle Colleen had retrieved sat on my desk. I photographed it next to the correct prescription for comparison, capturing the different manufacturer labels, the slight difference in pill color that you'd only notice if you were looking for it. For 2 decades, I had been the guardian of other people's fragile histories, preserving textiles and documents and artifacts that told stories about people who had died centuries ago. Now I was documenting my own potential ending with the same archival care. Over the next 3 days, I practiced the performance. At dinner, I drank the tea Lawrence prepared, or appeared to. I'd perfected the technique holding the cup long enough for it to cool slightly, bringing it to my lips, tilting my head back as if swallowing, while actually holding the liquid in my mouth, then excusing myself to the powder room where I spat it into the toilet and rinsed my mouth thoroughly. When Lawrence wasn't watching, I poured portions down the bathroom sink, always leaving enough in the cup that it looked like I'd consumed most of it. Each sample went into a specimen bag. Each bag got labeled and photographed. Each entry went into my notebook with clinical precision. I have preserved artifacts that were 500 years old. Now I am preserving evidence of my own attempted murder with the same methodical care. 3 days later, I told Lawrence I had a routine checkup in town and would be gone most of the afternoon. I drove 30 minutes outside Highlands to a private medical clinic I'd never visited before, far enough that no one from our social circle would see my car in the parking lot, close enough that the drive was plausible. Dr. Ernest Townsend, 65 years old, had been our family's concierge physician for 30 years and owed my father a debt that went back to a courtroom in 1999. When a wrongful malpractice lawsuit nearly destroyed everything he had built. The receptionist led me to a private exam room. Ernest came in a moment later, closing the door behind him with the practiced discretion of someone who had spent decades protecting wealthy patients' secrets. "It's good to see you," he said, reaching for my file. "I'm not here for a regular appointment." Something in my voice made him set the file down. I placed the cooler bag on his examination table and opened it. Inside were 5 specimen bags, each carefully labeled, each containing a different sample. Tea, food, water from the glass. Lawrence had poured for me at dinner. The swapped medication bottle. "Ernest, I need you to check these," I said. "And I need you to tell absolutely no one." He looked at the labeled samples, read the dates, read the careful notations I'd made on each bag. His expression went very still. What am I looking for? Anything that shouldn't be there. He picked up the tea sample from October 12th, held it up to the light, set it down carefully, and looked at me with the kind of focus he usually reserved for diagnosing difficult cases. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and old paper, and Ernest's hands were steady when he picked up the first sample, the same hands that had held my father's hand at his funeral 3 years ago. "Your father saved my career 25 years ago when no one else would stand beside me," he said quietly. "What do you need?" "Toxicology analysis, complete discretion, results that could hold up in court if necessary." "You think someone is poisoning you?" I think I need proof before I accuse anyone of anything." He looked at the samples again, at the medication bottle with the wrong pills inside, at the careful archival precision of my documentation. "How long has this been happening?" "Almost 2 years, based on symptom timeline. Who has access to your food and medication?" I didn't answer. We both knew there were only 2 people in that house with unrestricted access to everything I ate and drank. Ernest placed the samples in a locked refrigerator and made notes in a file he didn't add to my regular medical record. 25 years ago, my father had stood in a courtroom and told the truth when it cost him something to do. It's saving this man's career and reputation. Today, Ernest Townsend was going to save my life. 25 years ago, my father saved his career. Today, he'll save my life. Ernest's voice on the phone was careful and professional, but I heard what he wasn't saying in the pause before he asked me to come to the clinic that evening. "After hours would be best," he said. "I'd prefer privacy for this discussion." So Dr. Ernest Townsend had the answer my father's loyalty had purchased 25 years ago, and whatever he'd found in those samples was something we both needed privacy to discuss. I arrived at 7:30 after the last receptionist had gone home. Ernest let me in through the side entrance and led me to his private consultation room. The test results sat in a sealed manila envelope on his desk. "The sedatives are pharmaceutical grade," he said without preamble, opening the envelope and spreading the lab reports across the desk. "Administered in doses small enough to metabolize slowly. Combined with the anticoagulants, they create a pattern of symptoms that would look entirely age-appropriate in a woman your age." I looked at the numbers on the page. Traces of benzodiazepines, low-dose warfarin derivatives, substances that separately might be prescribed medications, but together in these concentrations told a different story. "How long?" I asked. He was silent for a moment, looking at the reports instead of at me. "At this dosage progression, 6 to 8 months before irreversible organ damage, possibly fatal within a year." 6 to 8 months before irreversible organ damage, he had given me a death sentence with an expiration date. "I know who it is," I said. He nodded slowly. "So do I. The question is what we do about it. First, I need you to document everything, medical legal documentation that could hold up in court. Second, I need baseline blood work now that I've stopped ingesting the substances, proof that my system is clearing." "You've stopped drinking the tea 10 days ago. Have you confronted them?" "No, and I won't, not yet." Ernest made notes in the file that didn't exist in my regular medical record, and I understood that my father's act of loyalty all those years ago had just bought me something more valuable than test results. It had bought me an ally who understood how to document evidence that could destroy someone in a court of law. 3 days later, I found the document. Lawrence had left his briefcase in our shared home office, the kind of careless mistake he'd made maybe twice in 30 years. He was in the shower. I had maybe 10 minutes. The briefcase sat on his desk unlocked. Inside was a legal document petition for conservatorship Caldwell Family Trust. I photographed the cover page and started reading. The petition was complete, notarized, ready to file. Prepared by Lawrence's attorney with clinical precision citing my progressive cognitive decline, impaired judgment, inability to manage complex financial affairs. The document listed specific instances, forgetting appointments I'd never forgotten, repeating myself in conversations that had never happened, difficulty with financial calculations I'd performed flawlessly for decades. All symptoms of the poisoning they were administering, documented as if they were natural deterioration. I photographed every page with steady hands, the same hands they had made tremble with their careful doses. The petition was waiting for one thing, supporting medical documentation from a physician who would attest to my diminished capacity. They didn't just want to kill me. They wanted to make me incompetent first sign over everything while I was still alive to make it legal. Conservatorship would give Lawrence control of the trust, the estate, every asset my father had spent 40 years building. And once they had legal control, my actual death could come later. An unfortunate decline, a tragic end to a woman who just couldn't manage on her own anymore. I replaced the documents in perfect order, closed the briefcase, and walked out of the office as Lawrence emerged from the shower. "Going down for tea?" he asked with practiced warmth. "In a moment?" I said, smiling the smile I'd perfected over 30 years. That evening, I stood in the second-floor hallway and heard voices from Lawrence's study. I stopped, held my breath, moved closer to the door he'd left slightly open. Savannah's voice came through the speakerphone, sharp and urgent. "You need to move faster. If she recovers before we file the papers, we lose everything, the trust, the estate, all of it. And we don't just lose the money, we face criminal charges." The hallway was dark, and I stood there listening to my husband and his mistress discuss how quickly they could legally erase me, and my hands didn't shake anymore. "Desmond is saying there's pressure from somewhere," Lawrence said, and he sounded tired, strained. "He wants out." Savannah's laugh was cold. "Desmond just needs more money. He always does. Give him another 20,000 and he'll stay in line. But you need to move faster on your end. We're running out of time. What if she figures it out?" "She won't. Look at her. She can barely hold a teacup without trembling. Another month and we'll have enough documentation for any judge to sign off on conservatorship. Then it doesn't matter what she figures out." I listened to them calculate the timeline of my incompetence like it was a shipping schedule. Then I walked back to my study and locked the door. They were racing against a timeline, accelerate the poisoning, get the medical documentation file, the conservatorship before I recovered or figured it out. But they had made one critical miscalculation. I had already figured it out. I had already stopped drinking the tea. And I was racing too, just in a different direction. They're racing against time. I have to race too. Different direction. Edna Gallagher's law office occupied the second floor of a brick building in downtown Highlands that had housed attorneys for over a century, and I climbed the stairs the morning after overhearing Savannah's voice, knowing I was about to ask the question my father had been waiting for me to ask for 30 years. They were racing to file the conservatorship petition before I recovered enough to fight, but I was racing toward the protection my father had built before I ever needed it. The reception area smelled like old paper and furniture polish. The walls were lined with photographs of Highlands in different eras, 1920s, 1950s, 1980s, a visual timeline of the town's slow evolution from mountain outpost to careful preservation of wealth. Edna Gallagher, 73 years old, had been the Caldwell family's estate planning attorney for over 30 years and sat behind a desk that had belonged to her own father before her, surrounded by filing cabinets containing every legal document that mattered to 3 generations of my family. She stood when I entered, and I saw recognition in her face, not just of me, but of something she'd been waiting to see. "I need to ask you about the trust," I said, closing the door behind me. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I've been managing your family's affairs since you were 8 years old. Ask whatever you need." I sat down and chose my words carefully. What happens if someone tries to claim conservatorship over me under suspicious circumstances? Edna was quiet for a long moment. She set down the pen she'd been holding and looked at me with absolute focus. "Your father told me that if you ever came to me asking that specific question, using those exact words, suspicious circumstances, I was to give you something he prepared before you were married." My heart was beating very fast. "He prepared something 30 years ago, the week before your wedding." She stood and walked to the floor, safe behind her desk, the kind of heavy antique vault that predated electronic locks. "He said if you never needed it, that would be the best outcome. But if you did need it, the protection would already be in place." She worked the combination and opened the safe. Inside, I could see rows of document boxes, each labeled with family names going back generations. She reached for one marked Caldwell Ernest Confidential and removed a sealed envelope. My father's handwriting on the front for Roxanne, to be opened only under circumstances we both hope never arrive. My father had been dead for 3 years, but in that moment he was the most present person in the room. Edna didn't hand me the envelope yet. Instead, she pulled out a file, the Caldwell family trust documents, the ones I'd signed dozens of amendments to over the years, the legal framework that held the fortune my father had built through 4 decades of careful stewardship. "There's a clause your husband has never seen," she said, opening the file to a page marked with a red tab. It's in a separate codicil that your father added the week before your wedding, filed only with this office, never shared with Lawrence or his attorneys. She turned the document so I could read it. The language was dense, legal precise, but the core was clear. If a petition for conservatorship is filed against Roxanne Caldwell, citing medical incapacity, cognitive decline, or diminished judgment under circumstances that suggest outside interference, undue influence, or financial motive, all assets held in the Caldwell Family Trust shall immediately freeze pending forensic investigation. If a conservatorship petition is filed citing your incapacity under suspicious circumstances, Edna explained, every asset in the Caldwell Trust freezes immediately real estate investments, liquid accounts, all of it. No transfers, no access. Complete lockdown. For how long? Until an independent forensic investigation is complete. The clause mandates examination of all financial records for the preceding 10 years, full medical documentation review, toxicology screening, if circumstances warrant, and verification that any claims of incapacity are legitimate rather than manufactured. How long does that take? The investigation can last up to 18 months. During that period, your husband cannot access $1. Not with a court order, not with medical documentation, not with anything. The trust goes into forensic lockdown and stays there until the investigation clears or finds evidence of fraud. He had built me a fortress 30 years ago and disguised it as paperwork waiting for the day I would need walls. Lawrence doesn't know this exists. No one knows except me and now you. Your father structured it as a protective codicil, activated only under specific threat conditions. It's perfectly legal, a grantor protecting his daughter's inheritance from potential exploitation. I looked at the clause again, read the trigger language, suspicious circumstances, outside interference, financial motive. My father had seen this coming 30 years ago. Not the specific details he couldn't have known about Savannah or Silas or the poisoning, but he'd understood that someone might try to take what was mine by first taking my capacity to defend it. And he'd built a legal mechanism that would destroy anyone who tried. When was this executed? June 2nd, 1994, 1 week before your wedding. I held the envelope my father had sealed 3 decades ago and understood something profound about the man who had saved Dr. Townsend's career, who had taught me to preserve fragile things with archival precision, who had walked me down the aisle to marry Lawrence Sinclair with a smile on his face. He had never said he didn't trust my husband. He had simply protected me before I knew I needed protecting. My father never said he didn't trust Lawrence, but he did this. The envelope was heavy in my hands, not with weight, but with 30 years of my father's foresight, and I broke the seal knowing that what I read next would change everything about how I saw myself. Edna gestured to a small side room off her main office. "You should read this in private," she said gently. "Take all the time you need." The room was simple, a table, 2 chairs, a window overlooking the street below. I sat down and carefully opened the envelope my father had sealed the week before my wedding. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his handwriting filling both sides in the careful script I recognized from a lifetime of museum labels and artifact documentation. The date at the top, June 2nd, 1994. My dearest Roxanne, if you're reading this, my dear daughter, it means you're in a situation where someone wants you to believe you're not strong enough to stand your ground. I need you to know something I should have told you more directly when I was alive, but perhaps didn't have the courage to say. You have never been weak. You have only been too kind to people who don't deserve your kindness. There is a difference, and I need you to understand that difference now. I'm writing this 1 week before your wedding. In 7 days, you'll walk down the aisle of the Presbyterian Church, and I'll give you to a man I've known for 2 years. He's charming, successful, from a good family. Your mother thinks he's perfect. Everyone thinks he's perfect. But I've watched him, and I've seen something that troubles me. It's not cruelty. He would never be overtly cruel. It's something subtler, a sense of entitlement, a belief that what belongs to you should belong to him simply because you've agreed to marry him. I could be wrong. I hope I am. If you're never reading this letter, then I was wrong and I'm grateful for it. But if you are reading this, then I was right, and you need to hear what I have to say. The one who truly loves you will never ask for your signature when you are at your weakest. If someone is pushing you to sign something while you're afraid, while you're confused, while you're being told you're not competent to manage your own affairs, stop. That is not love. That is theft. I raised you to be a curator, to preserve valuable things, to recognize authenticity from forgery, to understand that some objects claim to be precious but are actually worthless reproductions designed to fool people who don't look closely enough. Apply those same skills to your own life, my daughter. He wrote this letter to the daughter he knew I would become, not the 25-year-old bride who thought love meant accepting everything, but the 55-year-old woman who had finally learned the difference between kindness and surrender. I've put protections in place, legal structures that will activate if someone tries to claim you're not capable of managing what's yours. I've done this not because I don't trust you, but because I trust you completely, and I will not let anyone use your capacity for love and forgiveness as a weapon against you. If you're reading this, you've asked Edna about conservatorship under suspicious circumstances. That tells me you understand something is wrong. That tells me you're thinking clearly even when someone is trying to convince you that you're not. Trust that clarity. Trust the evidence you've gathered with the same precision I taught you to use in the museum. Trust the instincts that are telling you something isn't right. Trust the part of yourself that knows the difference between care and control. You don't need my permission to protect yourself. You never did. But if you're reading this and some part of you is still hesitating, still wondering if you're overreacting, still questioning whether you deserve to fight back, then hear this. You have my permission. You have my blessing. You have my full support even from beyond wherever I am now. Fight. Not because you're angry, though anger is appropriate. Not because you want revenge, though justice is your right. Fight because you deserve to preserve yourself with the same care you've shown to every fragile artifact that ever passed through your hands. I love you. I have always been proud of you, and I knew that if this day ever came, you would be strong enough to face it. Your father, Ernest Caldwell. I folded the letter with steady hands, the same hands that had trembled from poison 6 months ago, the same hands that had preserved artifacts for 20 years, the same hands my father had held when he walked me down an aisle toward a man he had known to protect me from. He hadn't been wrong about Lawrence. He'd seen something 30 years ago that I had convinced myself to ignore. And instead of forbidding the marriage or expressing his doubts in a way that would have made me defensive, he had quietly built me a fortress and left me a key I would find only when I needed it most. The letter wasn't advice, it was permission. Permission to stop being kind to people who were using that kindness to destroy me. Permission to recognize that what I'd called love for 30 years had really been a performance of surrender. Permission to fight back without guilt or apology. I sat in that quiet room with my father's letter and understood what he had given me 30 years ago when he built the legal fortress and wrote these words. He had defended me before I knew I needed defending. He had believed in my strength before I believed in it myself. And for the first time in 3 years since he died, for the first time in 30 years of marriage, I felt truly not alone. Father defended me before I knew I needed it. First time I truly feel not alone. I made the call to Boston from my study that evening with my father's letter still folded in my pocket and my voice completely steady for the first time in weeks. For the first time since reading my father's words, I felt truly not alone. And now I was about to bring my daughter into the fight he'd been preparing me for since before my wedding day. Celestine's number rang twice before she picked up. "Mom, is everything okay?" Her voice had the slightly worried edge it always carried when I called unexpectedly the tone of a daughter who had spent 28 years believing her mother was fragile, someone who needed protecting from difficult truths. "I need you to come home," I said. "Not because I'm in trouble, not because I need comfort, because I need a corporate tax attorney who I can trust with everything, and you're the only person who fits that description." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mom, Iat. Celestine's voice was uncertain, like she was trying to reconcile this tone with the woman she thought she knew. What's going on? I'll explain when you're here. Can you come tomorrow? Tomorrow I have depositions scheduled. Cancel them. Another pause, longer this time. This is serious. Yes. Are you safe right now? I am, but I need you here. Can you come? She was quiet for 3 seconds. I could almost hear her rearranging her schedule in her head, calculating what she could postpone and what would have to be handed off to colleagues. Then, I'll be on the first flight out. Thank you. Mom, we'll talk when you're here. I have a lot to show you. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet study and looked at the archive I'd been building for weeks. The preservation notebooks, the sealed evidence bags, the photographs, the financial analysis, the toxicology reports, the letter from my father that had changed everything. This was the first time in 28 years I had called my daughter and asked her to see me as something other than her mother. I was asking her to see me as myself. My daughter Celestine arrived from Boston the next afternoon, 28 years old corporate tax attorney with a firm handshake and her father's dark eyes carrying a professional briefcase I had never seen her use at home before. She hugged me at the door, searched my face for signs of crisis, found nothing that matched what she was expecting. You look... She started, then seemed unsure how to finish. Different. Yeah. Come with me. I led her directly to my study and locked the door behind us. The evidence was laid out on every surface: the desk, the side tables, the window seat, organized chronologically cross-referenced, preserved with museum-quality precision. Before I show you the evidence I laid out for my daughter, comment A, if you'd have called your child for help in this situation, or B, if you'd have kept it hidden. Add one short reason. Please note, what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. I had arranged the evidence the way I once arranged textile fragments in museum displays, each piece telling part of a larger story, the whole creating an undeniable narrative. Sit down, I said. Celestine sat. I handed her the first notebook, the one where I documented every symptom, every dizzy spell, every tremor dated, and timed with clinical precision. She read the first page, looked up at me. What is this? Keep reading. I watched her move through the evidence. The preservation bags with tea samples, Colleen's photographs time-stamped at 12:47 a.m., showing Mildred switching medication bottles, Ernest's toxicology report confirming pharmaceutical-grade sedatives and anticoagulants, the financial analysis tracing every dollar of the embezzlement through Crowther Asset Management over 10 years. Her expression shifted from confusion to shock to something harder: professional focus. When she reached the guardianship petition, Lawrence's completed legal document ready to file citing her mother's cognitive decline and inability to manage affairs, her hands went very still. She read it twice, then set it down carefully and looked at me. How long have you known? Long enough to prepare. Mom. Her voice cracked slightly. They've been poisoning you. Yes, for 2 years. Almost. And stealing from the trust for 10. Yes, and planning to have you declared incompetent so they could take everything legally, yes. Celestine stood up and walked to the window, stood there looking out at the mountains for a long moment. When she turned back, her face had changed. You've documented all of this, preserved it, like you used to do at the museum. I learned from the best teacher. My father taught me to recognize what's valuable and protect it, including myself. For the first time, my daughter looked at me without seeing the long-suffering mother who stayed quiet through everything. She saw someone who had been building a case with archival precision while everyone thought she was just enduring. Celestine set down the guardianship petition and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not pity, not worry, not the careful patience she had always shown her fragile mother. Something harder. Something that looked like respect. For the first time in her life, my daughter was seeing me as I actually was. Daughter looked at me without seeing suffering mother, saw someone ready. Celestine found it in the third hour of reviewing financial records, a 5-year-old email thread buried in the archived correspondence folder that made her go completely still. She had been looking at me as someone ready to fight, and now she was about to discover exactly how much there was to fight for. "Mom." Her voice was strange, flat, the kind of tone people use when they're trying not to feel anything while they're processing something devastating. "What is it?" She turned the laptop so I could see the screen. The email was dated April 2019, addressed to the hiring partner at Morrison & Blake, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in New York. The sender, Lawrence Sinclair. I read it once, then again. "Dear Mr. Morrison, I am writing regarding my daughter Celestine Caldwell's application for your summer associate program. Due to urgent family health circumstances that have recently come to light, Celestine will need to remain close to home for the foreseeable future. I must regretfully withdraw her from consideration at this time. We appreciate your understanding during this difficult period. Sincerely, Lawrence Sinclair." The email was addressed to the hiring partner at Morrison & Blake. Celestine said, her voice still eerily calm. "The firm I wanted more than anything when I was 23. Lawrence wrote that family circumstances required me to stay local." What family circumstances? There weren't any. I was in perfect health. You were in perfect health. There was nothing. I watched my daughter read the email her father had written to destroy her future, and I saw in her face the exact moment she stopped being his daughter and became my ally completely. "I thought they chose someone else because I wasn't good enough," she said. "I blamed myself for 5 years. Questioned whether I should even be a lawyer. Took the local firm position thinking I'd failed to compete at the national level." "You were good enough," I said quietly. "You were good enough before your father decided that keeping you close meant keeping you small." "He sabotaged my career so I wouldn't leave home." "Yes, because if I stayed local, I'd be easier to control when he needed to file guardianship." I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. Keep Celestine nearby. Keep her thinking she wasn't quite capable of the big opportunities. Make sure when the time came to declare her mother incompetent, there would be a dutiful daughter close by who believed her mother's decline was natural. Celestine closed the laptop very carefully. "I want to help you destroy him." "I know. Not just legally, I want him to lose everything." "That's the plan." 3 days later, Celestine introduced me to Russell Hewitt. Russell Hewitt, 57 years old, former Treasury Department fraud investigator with 30 years of experience tracking offshore money and corporate shell games, sat across from us in his Asheville office with the patient focus of someone who had seen every variation of financial crime. "Your daughter showed me the preliminary documents," he said, pulling up files on his computer. "I've done some initial research. I need to verify a few things before we move forward." He started going through the Crowther Asset Management documentation, the transfers the shell company structure, the routing of funds from my family trust through Desmond Ramsey's LLC, and eventually to the house in Spartanburg, the Range Rover Savannah's investment accounts. When he reached Desmond Ramsey's name, his expression shifted. "I know this name," Russell said, tapping the signature on one of the incorporation documents. "Desmond Ramsey is currently under federal investigation for offshore tax evasion, shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He's looking at serious prison time." Celestine leaned forward. "How serious?" 10 to 15 years if they prove everything they're alleging. He's got money hidden in 4 different tax havens, been running the scheme for over a decade. "That means he's vulnerable," I said. Russell nodded. "That means he's desperate. People facing that kind of time will trade anything for immunity or a reduced sentence. He's the weakest link in your husband's conspiracy. 9 years of supporting a child who wasn't her grandson, financing a lie that was poisoning me all because she wanted to believe. There's something else you need to know," Russell said, pulling up another set of documents. "I did some digging into the paternity situation. 9 years ago, your mother-in-law Mildred requested a paternity test when Silas was 1 year old. She wanted proof before she committed money," Celestine said. "Exactly. Desmond Ramsey arranged the test through a private laboratory he controlled. The results came back showing Lawrence as the biological father with 99.9% certainty. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The results were fabricated. Yes, Desmond owns a piece of the lab. The sample was never tested. The paperwork was manufactured. Mildred accepted the results without question because they told her what she wanted to hear, that her son finally had the male heir she'd been demanding. She was deceived, too, I said quietly, understanding something I hadn't wanted to see. Manipulated by the same people. But Celestine's voice was hard. She was deceived, Mom, but she also chose to keep believing the lie instead of protecting you. She's been paying for that child's private school for years. She knew about the affair. She knew about the stolen money. She chose the fantasy of a grandson over your safety. Russell nodded. Your daughter is right. Mildred Sinclair may have been initially deceived, but she's had 9 years to question those results to protect you to do the right thing. Instead, she funded the conspiracy and helped your husband poison you. That's not innocence. That's active participation. She's not evil, I said. She just desperately wants to believe what she wants is true. That makes her more dangerous, Celestine said. Russell closed his laptop and looked at both of us. Desmond Ramsey is facing federal charges and needs immunity. Your mother-in-law supported a lie for 9 years because it gave her what she wanted. Your husband has been systematically destroying both of you for a decade. The question now isn't whether we can prove it. The question is what you want to do when we have proof. And I knew exactly what I wanted. She's not evil, just wants to believe what she wants is true. More dangerous. Desmond Ramsey's cooperation came faster than any of us expected. Within 24 hours of Russell's contact, his attorney called back offering a meeting, and now we sat in Russell's office listening to a recording that changed everything. Mildred wasn't evil, just willing to believe what served her desires. But Desmond was different. He was desperate, and desperate people make excellent witnesses. This was recorded 3 weeks ago, Russell said, setting up the audio file on his laptop. Legal wiretap on Desmond's office phone as part of the federal investigation. They shared it with me after I explained what we were looking into. He pressed play. Static first, then voices Savannah and Desmond mid-argument. Savannah's voice came through tense, angry. We need more time before Lawrence files anything. If he moves too fast and she recovers... She won't recover, Desmond said. Not if he keeps the dosage consistent. But if she does, if someone figures it out, Silas is the key to everything. As long as Lawrence believes... Then Desmond's voice cut in, sharply urgent. Don't say it out loud, not here. Silence. 4 seconds of nothing but background noise. As long as Lawrence believes 4 words that contain 10 years of lies and millions in stolen assets. When they resumed talking, it was about wire transfers and account numbers, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like smoke from a fire they'd almost started. Russell stopped the recording. I looked at Celestine. She was staring at the laptop with an expression I'd seen on her face when she was dissecting complex legal arguments, focused, calculating, building a case piece by piece. She almost said it, Celestine said quietly. Almost admitted that Silas isn't Lawrence's biological son. She knows, I said. She's always known. Russell nodded. The question is whether Lawrence knows. My guess, no. He's been believing the lie for 10 years because he desperately needed it to be true. That's what makes him such a perfect target. Can we use this recording? Celestine asked. Not directly, it's part of an ongoing federal investigation, but it gives us direction. Russell leaned forward. I'm arranging for a real DNA test. Desmond has access to Silas's medical records through the private lab that processed the fake results 9 years ago. If what we're all thinking is true, if Savannah deliberately trapped Lawrence with a child who isn't his, this entire conspiracy collapses. How long for the test? I asked. 1 week, maybe less. We don't have much time. I know. That same week during dinner at the Caldwell estate, Lawrence made an announcement. He served me tea I wouldn't drink, set it carefully beside my plate with the gentle attention he'd shown for 2 years. I've scheduled a meeting with my attorney for next Saturday. He said, his voice warm with concern. Just to reorganize some of the property documents given how your health has been. I looked up at him. smiled the grateful smile I'd perfected. That's very thoughtful. I think it's prudent to have everything in order. He continued settling into his chair across from me. In case things continue as they have been, the tremors, the confusion, I want to make sure you're protected. Protected. The word he used when he meant controlled. Of course, I said. Whatever you think is best. He set the teacup in front of me with the same careful attention he had shown for 2 years, and I thanked him with the same grateful smile, and neither of us knew the performance was almost over. I've invited Mother to join us, Lawrence added. She's been so worried about you. I think it would comfort her to see that we're taking proper steps. Mildred. Of course. She would be there to witness me signing away my competence, my fortune, my future. The grandmother who had chosen a lie over my life because it gave her what she wanted. That's kind of her, I said. Under the table, my hand clenched around my napkin, hard enough that my nails cut into my palm through the fabric. I held it for 3 seconds, feeling the bite of pain, then deliberately released it. Less than 2 weeks. 13 days to finish what my father had started when he wrote that protection clause. 13 days to gather the last pieces of evidence. 13 days to prepare for the moment when Lawrence would walk into Edna's office expecting me to sign my life away and discover instead that he had walked into a trap 30 years in the making. Are you feeling all right? Lawrence asked, noting that I hadn't touched the tea. Just tired, I said. I think I'll skip the tea tonight and go straight to bed. You should drink it, he said gently. The warmth helps you sleep, and you need your rest for next weekend. Next weekend? When he planned to have me declared incompetent. When he thought he would take control of everything my father had built. You're right, I said and lifted the cup. I brought it to my lips. Let him see me tilt my head back slightly as if swallowing. Kept the liquid in my mouth until he turned away to clear his dinner plate, then poured it into the napkin on my lap and folded it carefully. Thank you for taking care of this, I said. He smiled, came around the table and kissed the top of my head the way he had for 30 years. That's what husbands are for. I sat at that dinner table and drank water instead of tea, while Lawrence talked about the weekend's plans, his voice full of the gentle concern of a husband caring for his declining wife. He said it like he meant it. I thanked him like I believed it. And I had exactly 13 days to finish what my father had started 30 years ago when he wrote that protection clause and sealed that letter. He said it like a concerned husband. I thanked him. I needed 2 more weeks. Russell called me at 6 in the morning. I needed 2 more weeks to finish what my father had started, but sometimes the universe gives you what you need exactly when you need it. Desmond wants to meet, Russell said. Wants to talk. I knew what that meant. The rats were abandoning ship. When? Today. This morning. He's terrified. The federal prosecutors are tightening the screws on the tax evasion charges, and he wants immunity before they file the formal indictment. What's he offering? Everything. 2 hours later, Celestine and I sat across from Desmond Ramsey in Russell's Asheville office. Desmond Ramsey was 40 years old but looked older, the kind of aging that comes from stress and poor choices compounding over time. He sat hunched in his chair, hands clasped on the table, looking like a man who had run out of options and knew it. I want immunity, he said before anyone else spoke. From everything. The federal charges, anything related to this situation with your family. Complete immunity in exchange for full cooperation. That's not how immunity works, Celestine said, her voice cold and professional. You don't get to negotiate terms before we know what you're offering. I'm offering everything. Desmond pulled a flash drive from his pocket and set it on the table. Financial records showing every transfer from the Caldwell Trust through Crowther Asset Management. Email chains between me and Savannah detailing the timeline. Meeting notes from when Lawrence first approached us about setting up the shell company. Bank statements, wire transfer receipts, everything you need to prove fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. I looked at the flash drive. 10 years of theft compressed into a small piece of plastic. Why, I asked. Because I'm looking at 15 years in federal prison and my wife is about to find out I've been helping her steal from you while poisoning you. Because I have 2 children and I'd like to see them graduate high school. Because Savannah is going to let me take the fall for all of it, and I'm not going down alone. Satisfaction mixed with contempt. Desmond was weak, self-serving, motivated entirely by fear, but his information was invaluable. Savannah knows something's wrong, Desmond continued. She's been panicking for weeks, calling Lawrence, constantly telling him to move faster, file the guardianship papers before you figure anything out. She knows the window is closing. Does Lawrence know, Celestine asked, about the poisoning? Desmond was quiet for a moment. I think he's convinced himself he's helping you, that he's managing your decline, protecting you from your own confusion. Savannah is very good at making people believe what serves her purpose. The DNA test was fake Roxanne. Savannah paid to have it done. Desmond said it quietly, almost apologetically, like he was confessing something he'd been carrying for too long. I'm sorry. The paternity test. The one Lawrence used 9 years ago to prove Silas was his son. Savannah paid a lab technician $15,000 to swap the samples. The child isn't his. The room went very still. I heard the words, understood them intellectually, but my brain couldn't quite process what they meant. Desmond pushed another document across the table. Text messages, payment receipts, bank transfers dated 2015. Savannah knew from the beginning, he said. She got pregnant by someone else, I don't know who, she never told me, but she was already involved with Lawrence by then, and she saw an opportunity. Convince him the child was his. Use the baby to lock him in emotionally, then start extracting money. For 10 years, I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Lawrence has believed he had a son for 10 years. Yes, he destroyed his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, stole millions, all for a child who isn't his. Yes? Celestine's face had gone white. She was staring at Desmond like he'd just spoken in a language she didn't understand. Russell cleared his throat, reached into his briefcase, and pulled out a manila envelope. I had an independent DNA test done 3 weeks ago, he said. Hair sample from Silas's baseball cap that Desmond provided. Comparison with Lawrence's medical records that Desmond also provided. The results came back yesterday. He slid the report across the table. I picked it up, read the technical language I didn't fully understand, then found the conclusion printed in bold at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The room was silent. Oh my God, Celestine whispered. I set the report down very carefully. 10 years. Lawrence had spent 10 years believing he had a son, had left me at 5 a.m. to drive to South Carolina and take that boy to school, had stolen from my family's trust to pay for private education and a house and a lifestyle for a child who didn't share his DNA, had poisoned me so he could take control of my fortune and continue funding a lie. Does Lawrence know? I asked. No, Desmond said. Savannah has been very careful to keep him believing. The fake paternity test 9 years ago was insurance proof he could show his mother proof that would satisfy anyone who questioned it. As long as Lawrence believes Silas is his son, he'll do anything to protect that child and the woman who gave him what he thought he wanted most. A male heir, I said quietly. Yes. I thought about Mildred, about the hospital room 13 years ago when she'd told me the Sinclair family needed an heir, about how desperately Lawrence had wanted to give her that to prove he wasn't the failure she'd implied he was for only having a daughter. Savannah had seen that desperation and weaponized it. What do you want me to do with this? I asked Russell. That's your decision, he said, but you now have proof of financial fraud, conspiracy, attempted poisoning, and deliberate paternity fraud. The question isn't whether you can destroy them. The question is how much you want them destroyed. I looked at the DNA report, at the flash drive containing 10 years of financial records, at Desmond Ramsey sitting across from me, terrified and self-serving and willing to betray everyone to save himself. 10 years, a child, all lies. I didn't know whether to pity Lawrence or despise him more, but I knew exactly what I was going to do with this information. I laid each piece of evidence on the mahogany table like artifacts in a museum, 30 years of betrayal cataloged and numbered. I knew exactly what I was going to do with the information about Lawrence, about Silas, about the decade of lies. I was going to use it the way my father had taught me to use every tool in a curator's arsenal, with precision, with care, and with absolute clarity about what deserved to be preserved and what deserved to be destroyed. 2 days before the scheduled confrontation, my team gathered at the Caldwell estate. Celestine sat at the table reviewing legal documents. Russell had his laptop open, cross-referencing witness statements. Edna stood at the head of the table with the settlement agreement in her hands, 73 years old and sharp as broken glass, having been the Caldwell family attorney for 40 years and knowing every secret we'd buried and every one we'd dug up. I arranged the evidence in chronological order. Earnest toxicology reports showing pharmaceutical-grade sedatives and anticoagulants in my system. Colleen's timestamp photographs of Mildred switching medication bottles at 12:47 a.m. The financial analysis tracing every dollar of the embezzlement through Crowther Asset Management over 10 years. Desmond's betrayal files with email chains and meeting notes documenting the conspiracy. The falsified DNA test from 2015 showing Lawrence as Silas's father. Russell's independent DNA test showing 0 probability of paternity. 30 years of marriage reduced to exhibits in a case file. "Are you ready for this, Mom?" Celestine asked, looking up from the settlement documents. I met her eyes. "I've been ready since the first week he called me confused. Since the first morning I counted his departure and didn't ask why." Edna set the settlement agreement on the table. "Let me be clear about what this document does. If Lawrence signs, he admits to the affair, the embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud. He surrenders all claims to the Caldwell Trust and agrees to repay the stolen funds with interest. He faces no criminal prosecution if he signs and complies with all terms. And if he refuses, I asked, then we file criminal charges within the hour. Attempted murder through systematic poisoning, grand theft, fraud, conspiracy. He's looking at 20 to 30 years in prison, and we have enough evidence to guarantee conviction. No middle ground. Sign and admit everything or fight and lose everything, including his freedom." The settlement includes one additional clause. Edna continued, "A public statement admitting the affair and financial fraud. Not details, but acknowledgement. It prevents him from spinning this as a misunderstanding or claiming you were unstable." I nodded. That was important. Let the truth be known, even if only in outline. Russell closed his laptop. All witness statements are ready. Colleen, Ernest, Desmond, they'll all testify if needed. But my guess is, he signs. No rational person fights a case this airtight. Lawrence isn't always rational when it comes to protecting what he thinks is his, I said. Then he'll learn. Celestine said, her voice hard. After they left, I walked through the quiet house alone. 30 years. I had been silent for 30 years. Not all at once, not from the first day. But slowly, gradually, I had learned to swallow questions and accept explanations and believe that keeping peace was the same as keeping love. I had been wrong. That night, I stood at my bedroom window overlooking the Blue Ridge Valley, the mountains dark against the November sky. I traced the entire journey in my mind. The first morning, I had counted 1,072 mornings before I understood what I was counting. The phone call in the garage, a boy's voice asking if Dad was coming, the tea I had pretended to drink while pouring it into napkins, my father's letter telling me I had never been weak, only too kind, the moment Celestine looked at me and saw someone building a case instead of someone enduring abuse, Colleen risking her job to photograph Mildred at midnight, Ernest running toxicology tests that could end his career if they were discovered prematurely, Edna holding documents my father had sealed 30 years ago waiting for me to ask the right question, Russell tracking money through shell companies because my daughter asked him to. I wasn't alone anymore. I hadn't been alone for weeks. But tomorrow I would walk into that room and face Lawrence, and in that moment I would be speaking for every silent year I had spent believing that love meant acceptance and marriage meant surrender. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me most of all. Somewhere along the way between discovering the affair and documenting the poisoning and learning about the DNA fraud, I had stopped being angry and started being tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of performing gratitude for care that was really control. tired of being the woman Lawrence needed me to be so he could be the man he wanted to believe he was. Tomorrow I would stop being tired. Tomorrow I would speak. Not for revenge. Revenge was hot and immediate and satisfying in the moment, but hollow afterward. I had watched enough people destroy themselves with revenge to know it wasn't what I wanted. I was doing this for Celestine, so she would never learn what I had learned, that staying silent was safer than speaking truth. So she would see that you could be kind without being weak, that you could preserve valuable things, including yourself. I was doing this to reclaim what had always been mine, my father's legacy, my own strength, the life I could have had if I hadn't spent 30 years believing that the man who once drove through a blizzard to save me would never be the man who poisoned my tea. I closed the evidence folder and set it by the door. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into that room and lay 30 years of silence on the table, not for revenge to reclaim what had always been mine. Tomorrow, I put 30 years on the table, not for revenge, to reclaim what's mine. Lawrence walked into the drawing room at exactly 9 o'clock, and I realized I'd been waiting 30 years for this moment. Tomorrow had arrived, and with it the reckoning. The Caldwell Estates grand drawing room had hosted christenings and funerals, wedding receptions, and business meetings. Today it would host the end of a marriage built on lies. Lawrence Sinclair walked in like a man who'd already won 58 years old, silver-haired, expensive suit, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. Behind him came Mildred, 79, and dressed in her pearls as if this were a social occasion, and Marcus Brennan, Lawrence's attorney, a sharp-faced man in his 40s who specialized in making wealthy men's problems disappear. Rebecca Hartley, the notary public, was already seated, a gray-haired woman in her 60s who'd spent 40 years witnessing signatures and keeping her mouth shut. Lawrence brought Mildred to intimidate me, to remind me that I was alone, that his family stood with him. He didn't know I had time-stamped photographs of her switching my medication bottles at midnight. He didn't know anything. "Good morning," Lawrence said, his voice warm and concerned. "How are you feeling today?" I met his eyes. Clear. Something flickered across his face. Surprised maybe that I wasn't trembling or confused, but he covered it quickly. "Good, that's good. This shouldn't take long." He gestured to Marcus. "Just some paperwork to ensure everything is properly organized." Marcus Brennan opened his briefcase and arranged documents on the mahogany table. The conservatorship petition, property transfer forms, trust modification agreements. Every page designed to strip me of control while making it look like care. "Mrs. Caldwell," Marcus said, sliding the first document toward me. "If you'll review the transfer documents." "She doesn't need to review anything." Lawrence interrupted, his voice taking on an edge. "My wife knows what she's signing." Rebecca the notary made a note on her pad. Good. She was paying attention. I picked up the document, read the first paragraph, set it down. "This gives you control of the Caldwell Trust," I said. "It ensures the trust is managed properly," Lawrence corrected, leaning forward. "Given your health issues, the confusion, the memory problems, I'm just trying to protect you." He said it like he meant it, like he'd practiced the words until they sounded genuine. Mildred sat very still, watching, waiting to witness me sign away everything my father had built. Marcus continued reading clauses, financial management provisions, healthcare decision authority, living arrangement considerations. The language was dense and legal, designed to sound protective while being predatory. Lawrence leaned toward me while Marcus droned on, spoke softly, but not so softly that Rebecca couldn't hear. "I've been planning this for 2 years, Roxanne," he said, his voice almost gentle. "Everything is already in place. The accounts, the arrangements, the medical documentation. You just need to sign." 2 words, that's all it took. He thought he was confiding in me, sharing the scope of his careful planning, demonstrating how thoroughly he'd considered my care. He didn't realize he was confessing before a legal witness. "Did you really think I wouldn't see you for what you are?" He continued, his voice dropping lower. "Weak, expendable. You've been barely functional for months. The tremors, the confusion. Everyone can see you're not capable of managing your own affairs anymore." I let him talk. Let every word be recorded in Rebecca's memory, in the silence of this room, in the confession he thought was victory. Then I met his eyes. "I know," I said. 2 words, clear, quiet, certain. Lawrence blinked. "What?" "I know," I repeated. The color started draining from his face. "What did you just say?" "I know about the planning. I know about the 2 years. I know about all of it." His mouth opened slightly. No words came out. I watched the exact moment he understood what I'd done. "I know about the tea," I said, my voice still quiet, still controlled. "The sedatives you've been giving me for almost 2 years, the anticoagulants, the careful dosing designed to make me appear confused and incompetent." Marcus Brennan's pen stopped moving. "I know about the embezzlement. Every dollar of the $2.3 million you stole from my family's trust over 10 years. The shell company, Crowther Asset Management, the house in Spartanburg, the Range Rover, Savannah's investment accounts." Mildred's face had gone very white. "I know about the medication Mildred has been switching. I have photographs, time-stamped, dated, showing her in my bathroom at 12:47 a.m., replacing my blood pressure pills with something else." Lawrence stood up, sat back down. His hands were shaking. "I know about Silas," I said. "I know about the affair, and I know about the DNA test Savannah paid $15,000 to falsify 9 years ago." Now his face went gray. That's impossible. The child isn't yours, Lawrence. The paternity test you showed Mildred was fake. We had an independent test done. 0 probability you're his biological father. 10 years. You destroyed our family for a child who isn't yours." The room was absolutely silent. Rebecca the notary was writing very quickly now, documenting everything being said. Lawrence looked at Mildred, at Marcus, at me. "You can't, this isn't—" "I have toxicology reports," I said. "Medical testimony, financial forensics, video evidence, recorded confessions, DNA proof. Everything documented with the same precision my father taught me when I was a museum curator." I stood up. "You thought I was weak because I didn't fight. You thought I was expendable because I stayed quiet. You planned this for 2 years, and I've been documenting it for 3 months. You confessed your crimes in front of a notary public, and now you have a choice." I placed a different document on the table. The settlement Edna had prepared. "Sign this. Admit the affair, the theft, and the fraud. Surrender all claims to the Caldwell Trust. Repay what you stole. Or I file criminal charges within the hour and you spend the next 20 years in prison." I watched the realization break across his face like glass. 2 words "I know" and 30 years of silence became the loudest thing in that room. From that moment, he lost. I know, those 2 words are all I need to say. From that moment, he lost. I stood, and the sound of my chair scraping the floor was the only noise in that silent room. Lawrence's face had gone from arrogant confidence to stunned comprehension in the space of 2 words. Rebecca the notary gathered her supplies quietly, understanding that what she'd just witnessed would likely be cited in criminal proceedings. The door clicked shut behind her. I walked to the hallway and opened it. Celestine entered first, followed by Edna Gallagher, then Russell Hewitt. They'd been waiting as planned in the library across the hall. Each carried a portion of the archive we'd assembled over the past 2 months. Lawrence watched them arrange folders and documents on the dining table. Mildred remained frozen in her chair, hands gripping the armrests. "This is everything," I said. "Every lie, every theft, every betrayal." The first folder contained toxicology reports. I opened it, spread the pages across the polished wood. Pharmaceutical-grade sedatives and anticoagulants in my blood samples. Dr. Townsend ran these tests in September, after I finally understood why I couldn't think clearly anymore. Russell placed the second file in front of Lawrence. Photographs time-stamped showing Mildred in my bathroom at 12:47 a.m. on November 3rd, her hands on my medication bottles. "Video footage exists as well," I said. Celestine set my phone on the table and pressed play. Mildred's voice, clear and unmistakable. "The blue bottle tonight. She nearly woke up yesterday." Mildred made a sound, small, strangled. Edna laid out the financial records next. 10 years of transfers, the shell company structure Russell had traced through 4 offshore accounts, every transaction documented. $2.3 million, I said. Embezzled from family, trusts my father spent 40 years building. The money didn't go to business investments. It went to Savannah Ramsey and the child you believed was your son." Lawrence picked up the financial summary. His hands trembled. "Desmond Ramsey runs Crowther Asset Management." I continued. "Savannah's husband, he's been documenting these transactions since 2019, waiting for the right leverage. I provided it." Marcus Brennan, who'd been standing near the window reviewing documents on his phone, stepped forward. He glanced at the evidence spread across the table, then at Russell, then at the door Rebecca had just exited. "Lawrence," he said quietly, "I'm withdrawing as your counsel effective immediately. You'll receive formal notice by end of business today." He left without waiting for response. The door closed with finality. Not one of them spoke. They couldn't. The last folder sat unopened on the table. I picked it up, removed 2 documents, placed them side by side in front of Lawrence. "DNA test results," I said. "The first is from 2015. It shows 99.8% probability that you're Silas Ramsey's biological father. The second is from October 2024, using samples Russell obtained independently. It shows 0% probability of biological relationship." Lawrence stared at the documents, picked them up, set them down, picked them up again. "Savannah paid $15,000 to falsify the original test," I said. "Silas isn't your son. You've spent 9 years believing he was yours. You embezzled $2.3 million to support him. You systematically poisoned your wife to secure her trust fund for his future, and the entire premise was fraudulent. The DNA test. That's impossible," Lawrence said, but his voice broke on the last word. Mildred finally moved. She stood cross to the table, picked up the DNA results. Her hands shook as she read them. She looked at Celestine, our daughter, her actual granddaughter, and something in her face collapsed. "It's not impossible," Russell said. "I obtained samples from Silas Ramsey's hairbrush and from Mr. Sinclair's electric razor. Independent laboratory blind processing. The results are definitive." Lawrence sat down heavily in the nearest chair. He compared the 2 DNA reports again, line by line, as if close examination might reveal some error, some explanation that would restore the fiction he'd built his crimes upon. "She lied to me," he said softly. "Many people lied to you," I said, "but you chose to believe them." He set the reports down, aligned them precisely at the table's edge, such a Lawrence gesture, the compulsion for order, even as his world disintegrated. I thought he was mine," he whispered. "And here's what I hadn't expected. I felt sorry for him. Not the way you'd pity a victim. Lawrence had made his choices, committed his crimes with full agency. But watching him process the realization that the child he'd believed was his son, the boy he'd embezzled millions to provide, for the reason he'd given himself permission to poison his wife, none of it had been real. He destroyed everything for a lie he didn't know was a lie. For one moment, I saw the man I'd married 31 years ago, the one who'd held my hand in the hospital when we lost our second child, the one who'd wanted to build something lasting. Then the moment passed. "What happens now?" Lawrence asked, still staring at those DNA results. "Now the conservatorship petition I mentioned gets filed," I said. "The one naming you as the incapacitated party based on your witnessed confession that you've spent 2 years poisoning your wife. The district attorney will review evidence of attempted murder and embezzlement. Your mother will face conspiracy charges for her role in the poisoning." I gathered my folders, returned the documents to their protective sleeves. Celestine, Edna, and Russell did the same. We'd shown what needed to be shown. The evidence would speak for itself in court. "The trust assets will be recovered." Edna said, her voice professionally neutral. "The conservatorship will ensure you can't access or transfer any additional funds pending criminal proceedings." Lawrence didn't respond. He sat at the table, surrounded by the wreckage of his schemes, shoulders curved inward, still holding those 2 DNA reports that had shattered his entire rationale. Mildred stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder. It was the first genuinely maternal gesture I'd witnessed from her in 3 decades, offered not in celebration or pride, but in shared defeat. I walked to the door, then looked back one final time. He didn't cry, just sat looking at hands that made tea for me. I left. I drove to Edna's law office in Highlands 3 days later. The confrontation was over, but the aftermath had just begun. Edna laid out the legal consequences like a surgeon listing amputations, methodical, necessary, irreversible. The trust clause your father built into the estate structure activated the moment Rebecca Hartley notarized Lawrence's confession, she said. We sat in her conference room, me Celestine, Russell, and Edna, surrounded by 30 years of Caldwell family legal documents. Every asset under the Caldwell Trust umbrella froze automatically. Lawrence can't access, transfer, or leverage a single dollar. Celestine leaned forward. He confessed to attempted murder in front of a legal witness. What happens now? The district attorney received our evidence package yesterday, Russell said. Toxicology reports video footage, financial records, DNA fraud documentation. They're opening a criminal investigation for attempted poisoning, embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Your father designed that trust clause in 1994. Edna continued opening a folder to show the original document, my father's signature bold across the bottom. He specified that if Lawrence ever confessed to fraud, theft, or harm against you, before any legal witness, notary attorney judged the assets would freeze immediately and revert to your sole control. Ernest planned for this exact scenario 30 years ago. I stared at my father's signature. He'd known. Not the specifics, perhaps, but the possibility. He'd built protection into the foundation itself, a fail-safe I'd never known existed until I needed it. What about Savannah? I asked. The embezzlement charges extend to her, Russell said. Desmond's cooperation documents show she knew the funds were stolen. The house Lawrence bought her in Charleston, the cars, the private school tuition, all purchased with embezzled assets. She'll lose everything. And Desmond, partial immunity in exchange for testimony and full financial disclosure, Edna said. He won't face charges, but his offshore banking record follows him forever. No reputable firm will touch him. Mildred. Edna's expression shifted something close to satisfaction. She escapes criminal prosecution. Her attorney negotiated that she was following Lawrence's medical instructions, didn't understand the criminality. But socially, she's finished. Her church asked her to step down from the Historical Preservation Committee. The Garden Club rescinded her lifetime membership. Everyone knows what she did. They each lost exactly what they wanted most, Edna said quietly. Russell nodded. Lawrence wanted control. Savannah wanted money. Mildred wanted respectability. Each one lost the thing they committed crimes to protect. Celestine looked at me. And what did we get back? The question hung in the air. $2.3 million, yes. Legal vindication. Public acknowledgement of what had been done to me. But what I'd actually reclaimed felt harder to quantify. Clarity, I said finally. We got back the truth. What do you call it when everyone gets exactly what they deserve? Not revenge, that word suggests emotion, passion, heat. This was colder, more precise. The machinery of consequence set in motion by choices made over years, finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. We reviewed documents for another hour, asset recovery timelines, criminal prosecution schedules, civil suits Edna recommended filing once the criminal cases concluded. The legal architecture of justice built one filing at a time. Celestine left first back to her office in Charleston. Russell departed shortly after. I stayed. There's one more thing, I said when Edna and I were alone in the conference room. She waited. The boy, I said. Silas, what happens to him? Edna's expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. He's not your responsibility, Roxanne. I know, but he's 10 years old. He doesn't know about the DNA fraud, the false paternity test, any of it. As far as he understands, Lawrence is his father, and his world is falling apart. Savannah will lose the house, the assets Lawrence provided, but she has family in Georgia. They'll manage. What about his school? Edna set down the pen she'd been holding. Private academy. Tuition is $18,000 annually. When Savannah's assets are seized, she won't be able to afford it. I looked out the conference room window at Highlands Main Street autumn leaves skittering across pavement. Thought about a 10-year-old boy whose mother had used him as leverage in an embezzlement scheme, whose father wasn't his father, whose entire life was built on lies he didn't create. I want his tuition guaranteed, I said. Through high school graduation, set up a separate education fund not touching Caldwell estate assets. Anonymous. He should never know it came from me. Edna stared at me. You want to pay for the education of the child from your husband's affair? The child he embezzled millions to support? I want to protect an innocent child from adult sins, I said. Silas didn't choose any of this. He's not responsible for what Savannah did, what Lawrence did, what any of them did. Roxanne, that's what my father would have done, I said. Protected the innocent, punished the guilty, but never confused the two. Edna was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened a fresh legal pad, began making notes. I'll establish the fund through a third-party trustee, she said. Education expenses only distributed directly to the school. No contact with the family, no acknowledgement of source. The boy will never know. Good. The boy doesn't even know my name, and I want to keep it that way. I gathered my coat, my files. Edna walked me to the door. Your father would be proud, she said quietly. I thought about the letter he'd left me, the one that had given me permission to fight. The trust clause he'd built 30 years ago. Protection I'd never known I had. The legacy of a man who'd understood that real strength wasn't about control or domination. It was about protecting what mattered, even from threats you couldn't yet see. I hope so, I said. I drove home through November twilight past properties my father had developed, buildings that still carried the Caldwell name. The boy doesn't know my name or who I am in his life. He doesn't know his father isn't his father or that his mother destroyed a family for money. But I know he's just a child, and I won't make him pay for what they did. That decision, protecting a child who bore no guilt for adult crimes, marked the beginning of something I hadn't expected. Peace. Celestine and I sat in twilight silence on the back porch, watching the Blue Ridge Mountains fade into evening, and for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace. Several weeks had passed since the confrontation. December had arrived with its particular mountain clarity, the kind of cold that sharpens edges and makes distant ridges stand out against sky. "Are you keeping this house?" Celestine asked. I looked at her, my daughter, 28, sitting in the same chair she'd occupied as a child during summer visits with her grandfather. The question surprised me. "This is your grandfather's house," I said. "Of course I am." I thought, with everything that happened here, Lawrence, the poisoning, all of it. "Lawrence lived here," I said, "but it was never his. My father built this house in 1962. He designed every room, chose every stone for the foundation. This is Caldwell land. I won't let what Lawrence did take that from me." Celestine was quiet for a moment, watching mist rise from the valley below. "I'm sorry for thinking you were weak, Mom," she said softly. I turned to look at her. She wasn't crying, but her voice carried weight. I recognized the kind that comes from revising your understanding of someone you thought you knew completely. "You don't need to apologize," I said. "You only need to see me more clearly." "I do now," she said. "I spent years thinking you just accepted everything. Let him control the money, make all the decisions, shape your entire life around his schedule. I was angry at you for it." "I know. But you weren't passive. You were building a case." "No," I said. "Not at first. At first I really was just surviving. The difference came when I decided surviving wasn't enough." We sat watching twilight deepen into evening. Somewhere in the valley, lights began appearing in houses I'd known my entire life. The Caldwell estate sat above them all exactly as my father had intended, not as dominance, but as stewardship, watching over what mattered. "Will you come for Christmas?" I asked. "Yes," Celestine said, "I will." The next morning, I walked past the antique clock on the second-floor hallway. It had ticked in this house for almost 100 years, brought over from my grandmother's family estate in Virginia. Walnut case brass fittings, a mechanism so precise it only needed winding once a week. Lawrence had wound it every Sunday morning for 31 years, the one household ritual he'd maintained without fail. I stopped, Put my hand on the case, felt the smooth wood under my palm. I remembered the first morning I'd counted September 24th, when I'd finally understood what those departures meant. 1,072 mornings of him leaving at 5 a.m., and I'd spent weeks calculating backward trying to map betrayal onto a calendar. Now I didn't need to count anything. I wound the clock, just like that. The key turned smoothly. The mechanism engaged with its familiar clicking rhythm. I adjusted the hands to the correct time, closed, the glass, face stepped back. It kept ticking. I walked away. The following morning I woke at 5 a.m. For weeks after discovering Lawrence's phone this hour had haunted me. I'd lie awake listening for car engines' footsteps on stairs, doors, closing quietly in pre-dawn darkness. The architecture of betrayal built one departure at a time. Now there were no car sounds, no doors closing, no one leaving. I got up, walked to the bedroom window overlooking the Blue Ridge Valley. Mist hung in layers between ridges, dissipating slowly as dawn light touched the eastern sky. The same view I'd seen for 31 years, but different now. Clearer. I went downstairs, brewed a cup of tea. Not chamomile, I'd thrown out every box of chamomile in the house the day after the confrontation. Earl Grey instead prepared exactly the way I preferred, water heated to 200 degrees steeped for exactly 4 minutes, 1 teaspoon of honey. My tea, my way. I carried it back upstairs, sat in the chair by the window, and drank it slowly. The valley filled with light, gradually the way it always did. Mist burned off. Birds began their morning routines. The world continued its rotation, indifferent to human drama, exactly as it should. 5 in the morning. And I was finally free. For 30 years, I'd defined myself in relation to Lawrence's schedule, his needs, his plans. The museum curator who'd given up her career to manage his household, the wife who'd accepted his explanations, his late nights, his early departures, the woman who'd swallowed poison literally and metaphorically day after day because leaving seemed impossible. But I'd learned something in those months of investigation, those weeks of building evidence. Those final days of confrontation, I'd never been the person I thought I was. I wasn't weak, I was patient. I wasn't passive, I was strategic. I wasn't trapped, I was gathering documentation. The difference between those interpretations, weakness versus patience, passivity versus strategy, came down to one thing: outcome. And the outcome was sitting in my hands right now, warm ceramic mug, in morning light, alone in a house that finally felt like mine. Lawrence had left at 5 in the morning for 1,072 days, believing he was building a secret life with a woman who'd lied to him about paternity stealing from trusts my father had built, poisoning a wife he'd grown tired of. And I, after 30 years of silence, of counting, of swallowing poison, both literal and metaphorical, had finally learned to extricate myself from a lie. Not with rage, not with violence, not with the kind of dramatic confrontation that burns everything down and leaves nothing standing. With truth, documented, notarized, legally witnessed truth. With patience. The kind my father had taught me, the kind that waits for the right moment instead of forcing the wrong one. With evidence. Toxicology reports and financial records and DNA tests and video footage, the accumulated weight of facts that couldn't be argued away or explained into irrelevance. I finished my tea as sunrise touched the valley, painting ridges gold. He left at 5 in the morning for a child who wasn't his. I, after 30 years, finally learned to extricate myself from a lie. And to you listening to my story, remember this. For 31 years, I thought patience meant accepting silence. I thought loyalty meant swallowing doubt. Don't make my mistake of confusing endurance with wisdom. If something feels wrong, trust that instinct. If someone's patterns don't add up, start documenting. The evidence I wish I'd gathered sooner might have saved me years of poison, both literal and emotional. Stories like mine, revenge, cheating stories, and true family stories that end in justice rather than devastation, teach us something important. Truth documented is more powerful than rage expressed. When you're facing betrayal, become a curator of evidence, not a victim of emotion. I believe God gave me the patience to wait for the right moment instead of reacting in the wrong one. These revenge cheating stories we share aren't about cruelty. They're about clarity. True family stories show us that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Justice delayed can still be justice delivered. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done differently or share your own experience. These revenge-cheating stories and true family stories need to be heard. If you know someone who needs this message, please share it with them. And if you'd like more stories like this, subscribe to Her Vengeance. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. I appreciate every moment you've spent with me. As a reminder, some details in this story have been adjusted for impact and reflection, but the message, the heart of what I learned, is real and true.